Today marks the 74th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and its preamble. This year, the slogan calls for dignity, freedom and justice for all. But in Tibet, the Tibetan people continue to suffer from the Chinese government's suppression of peaceful expression and merely exercising basic human rights with arbitrary arrest, unjust sentencing, torture and incommunicado detentions. This special episode will focus on the plight of the Tibetan political prisoners who continue to receive inhuman treatment in the prisons run by the Chinese government and whose quality of lives are taken away from them. The universal definition of a political prisoner is someone who has been imprisoned for criticizing or disagreeing with the policies of their government. In Tibet, it is up to the Chinese government to take anyone, anything, and press unlawful charges.
See, when you look at China's law, People's Republic of China has its own constitution. But it's not a matter whether they have a constitution or not. The matter is whether they really go along with the rule of law. So far in China, Chinese government do not acted upon the constitution. So therefore, in the eyes of the Chinese government, any Tibetans who long for the preservation of culture, identity, language, ecology, anything which concerns with Tibet are to be considered as apolitical, which goes against the Chinese government's thoughts and ideas and policies. So they are all being treated as a political prisoners. So far in Tibet, there are so many political prisoners which are still languishing in prisons.
안주 배바티 대주 겹dünya 지집에나 단대 미럽 지자비나 디림바도 지비나 로타 지 숨줄이 녀바차 용고를 딘조기 뒤럽디게 깔래 겹된 요디게디 코치 사주동주 저와 면나면나 지 내가 지니 마되어버체 얘네면은 롭다 조니 마되어봐 그봐 얘네면은 지 공배나 이면은 최 지니 마되어버체 제고 종아 중교 개마로봐 가르스는 콘도 장말로 가르 통구여었으나 야나 슝기 시주디 칸에시아버지다 라글린다원이 겸게줘버지 자나 슝기 짜짐나로리아 셰바티당 산에 사도리아 아니 라글린 따당기 개바베는 미리 인제기 개바다 우차샤나 하이 미리 따당다 아니 정유 미리 야나면은 베베돌 따당 딘주 뱃들 로가지 두고 유버선자 아니 되게 지금 수인내래 심지 투비진비네 야고 마치니들 가고 지금 말어 봤다 안가 디베장은 베베라 우차샤나 조직내 소수 강리야 미신다 지금 징배가는选제 대요리选예 대양 안에 베드 지가서라 독접 전부 지금选대비나 수인의 기니도 말봐 댐 기니마도 딘제고 돈에 전련 체제 딱 간단 도도로 체시나 대우시제 딱 가서라 첩시기 랭구 빼고야 금세.
So under the Chinese criminal law there are no political offenses that are listed separately. But that is also a problem because the Chinese government can now, vaguely interpret any act of crime as, endangering national security or as a threat to the state. So a lot of Tibetans are usually charged with the crimes such as endangering national security, leaking state secrets and inciting separatism. So these are the charges that Tibetans are usually charged with.
After China illegally occupied Tibet in 1959, Tibetan military garrison in Lhasa was transformed into a prison, though it retained the semblance of army camp well into the early 60s. Tibetan prison has over the years mutely witnessed Chinese brutality and beatings, death and deceit from the days of Chinese invasion in the 1950s down to the infamous Cultural Revolution of 60s and 70s to the 80s active pro-independence period up till the present times. So far, the known number of prisons and detention centers in Tibet is around 172. Venerable Ngawang Webar is a former political prisoner who was arrested in 1987 during the pro-independence demonstration in Lhasa along with fellow monks from Debu Monastery days after His Holiness the Dalai Lama delivered historic 5-point peace plan in Washington, D.C. to the members of the U.S. Congress.
자나 슝기 카데 디시고 여러와 먼저 야 아니 지동국 영업 중하고 십주시운의 영제 진주단체 별이 지조 그 배대 비조의 배대 독자 시부실에 대만주 진주단체 아니 미만의 디지털가 용부 있어 셰되고 여러와 제당에 딜리아 랭가르스 되고르스나 자나 슝기 변화를 디지털 여다 매사디 아니 업중하고 공기 중앙 가져도 변화를 자나 슝 별을 레베 제리야 변화로 중앙 가져도 배다고 차시나 업중하고 공리야 별 교용 거는 중앙 지슈디 일이요 말봐 다 종소설로 중앙 취취 된데 얘기를 들래 그냥 중앙 지슈디 해세 쉬게 중앙 세제 쉬 중앙 세제 보달래 규미게 중앙 주요래 다나신 박원나로기 박원나로도 되들 난스샤 중앙 사주래 다 딘족이 룩규도 로제 대원도가라 좀봐 장가 주중안에 망가 중요면 놓아켰네 다 단단하고 자시는 배는 구조 중앙 자시는 건좀 입에 걸러 좀봐 부주고 숨겨락도 저래 아나 보면 다가는 시요래 아나 구조 중앙라 중앙 가수면 부중앙지 보면 중앙지 아 다게나로 좁게 맨다고 좀 봐지 요래 부구 중앙지 다 부중앙 거라는 건좀 입에 걸려 숨겨락도 저래 다 다나숑기 지조 야게다 벤조 야게다 미리아 셰윤 요바스유 벤조 야게다 유 지조 야게다 유 사람이나 좀만 먹고 가르친 차그래.
According to testimonies of many former political prisoners, they were subjected to a range of torture techniques and cruel and degrading treatments. They were beaten with electronic batons, given electronic shocks during interrogations, and denied food and water. Most of them were kept in incommunicado detention, which means they are kept under unfair trials and authorities do not provide information about why they have been arrested and where they are. Let alone family members have no idea where they have been detained, and those who do find out are not permitted to visit the prison. One such case of high-profile political prisoner, Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, who certainly died in Chinese prison due to torture in July 2015. The Chinese authorities had ignored medical parole and later cremated his remains against his family's wishes. The Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy published a dedicated database site on the Tibetan political prisoners list last year, which aims to monitor and document human rights violations committed by the Chinese authorities in Tibet. The database enlisted details of 5,580 plus Tibetan political prisoners from the 90s till now.
So, according to the database, we have over 3,000 prisoners that have been released and 1,800 prisoners that are still in detention in detention centers and prisons. And we also have over 300 prisoners who have completed their sentences, but there is no news on their release. And over 200 of them have been sentenced to imprisonment of various terms. Around 100 of these prisoners have died due to torture or due to post-release illnesses or other reasons.
On 17 December 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, wherein the first rule says all prisoners shall be treated with the respect due to their inherent dignity and value as human beings. And no prisoner shall be subjected to, and all shall be protected from torture and inhuman degrading punishments. But the question is whether the Chinese government respects these principles and rules at all.
If you look at the stature of China's prison, especially those who are concerned with the political prisoners, it's horrible, in fact. We have seen through the testimonies for so long, and even for China, those who break civil laws are being treated far better than those who raise the voice for the cause of Tibet, for the justice, for equality, and for preservation of Tibetan language and culture. So the situation is pathetic. People are being tortured and have been given a sentence for more than 10 years just for simply raising the voice. So therefore, in China, to our understanding, they are not at all practicing rule of law. The party is the epitome, and the Tibetan people are still very much suffering inside Tibet.
다 종가 나로기 나르주사데 단지 조절사데 그 베게는 나르주스로 다 나르주데 단지 권을 쉬는 시들에 다 되네지지지다 나르주데 체례 되네 나르주기 쇠마tum니 미대로 신경만 보여래 나르주 땅야 망자니 아니 베데 베나가서 다 통마 통존이디 간도 데려와 갔어래 하버트링 변종 룸딩 순배 루주 라바트링 사탕 것도 돼 지라게 라바트링 조가사디 되게 지진시 겸교지로 다 딘족이 다 배진 라바트링디 갑 뒤뒤기 다 나르주 코나 원에 민주 교내 매바 나르주 챌린데 수부배 촐라다니 베니 총이 당부디 루주 라바트링 차도래 다 대지라 아니 종간나로 전부만 보여래 종간나로 정식이니만 보 중요래 종간에 르베 지라 다 민주 침모도 있잖아 슝기 다 미디 용사 말했으면 두가라 아니 네 말로저 다네 종간나라 시비리사기 총벌사기 이들리는 코란돌 민제 연구요 선사 아니 말로 르네는 다와지니 다 규링 같은 들 로직 교육 유나면 딘데 제제 총조 망고 싶지 중요해 다 되게 가르친 거를 삼나 말조디 챌린 대바 직체 다 야나 슝고 코란도 그 좀발이야 니리기 칼라게 덮단 줘라 다디 무고 장가 줘다가 세부게 증금에도 다 될래 센지 체네 디네 주 우베는 니머리에 또도지 세시 주변에 답변은 지고 뭐 재미고 뭐지 뉴스 좀 주고 세시 주변에 네 찾아 마마데브체 디 아니 종간 코란 쪽에 달래가 지니다 된족이 꼭서 체네 다 돕제기 내단도 교부 내가도 숙체자 배나 내가도 좀 배나 잡지도 자시나 내주도 뺀 미스기 챌린데 봐 그러다 내수디양 증원에 저는 전부링기 팀다 뭐팀배 내가 고로 추주 쭉쭉쭉이 제 딘저기 다 내가도 숙체자 아니 내가 디양 아니 배디 지기 숙래 망고 싶지.
So, as every human being that is entitled to basic human rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a universal international human rights instrument, Tibetan political prisoners have a lot of rights under the instrument. Under Article 5, no one should be subjected to torture or cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment, and under Article 9, no one should be subjected to arbitrary detention. And as we know that Tibetans are arbitrarily detained without adequate charges by the Chinese police authorities. So under Article 10 and 11, they talk about the right to free and fair trial of individuals. And we also know that a lot of Tibetan political prisoners are imprisoned in secret trials and are not adequately represented in the judicial system. So that is their rights are also getting violated in that sense. So when we talk about Article 18, 19 and 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it guarantees everyone the freedom of expression and opinion, everyone the freedom of religion, and to peacefully assemble and associate with groups of people. So all of these rights of the Tibetan political prisoners are being violated when they are being held in detention. So under the Chinese law, they can, the pre-trial detention period is actually for 6 months, but a lot of Tibetan prisoners are, held in detention for longer than what is prescribed under their own law. So, yeah.
When we talk about Tibetan political prisoners, it would be unfair to name just a few, but let's just highlight few prominent cases here. Ama Ade, Venerable Palden Gyatso and Takma Jingmi Sangbo were one of the longest-serving prisoners who was first arrested pre-1959 and served the prison sentence and tortured through the cultural revolutions. Ama Ade served 27 years of her life in prison, and Takma Jingmi Sangbo spent 37 years in prison near Lhasa.
But somehow, when you look at overall understanding of political prisoners inside Tibet, it's fact that those Tibetans who are conscious enough to understand about Tibetan identity, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion and ecology, and those who have been doing services to the Tibetan community are being tagged as something some kind of threat to the party. So most of the Tibetan political prisoners are within those sections who are writers, philanthropists, businessmen, and then those lamas who are doing great services to the Tibetan communities. They are being labeled as a political something which goes against the Chinese government, and being labeled and being detained and arrested for their services. So it is not, I believe that even now, due to the COVID pandemic, there are so much outbursts in Tibet, and we fear that even those people who have raised their voice against the stringent COVID law policy inside Tibet were also being reprimanded, and so therefore it's a matter of concern for Tibetans.
Mr. Tenzin Chunbe, who is a Tibetan entrepreneur and philanthropist, so he was sentenced to 18 years in May 2019 on charges of inciting separatism and on financing activities that endanger state security, and also for illegally providing information and intelligence overseas. So he was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment plus 5 years of political deprivation. So he was initially detained in March 2018, but he was put to trial and imprisoned only in May 2019. So that means that he was held incommunicado for over a year, which is way over the prescribed limit of pre-trial detention that is allowed under the Chinese criminal law. And so Mr. Kama Samdrup is a Tibetan environmentalist who is known for his environmental conservation and protection work. He also founded the Three Rivers Environmental Protection Group with his brothers, and he was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment in 2010, and he is expected to be released in 2025. And then we have Rishi Chiner, who is a retired doctor from Lhasa, and she was imprisoned in March 2008 for on charges of espionage and for providing information to the Tibetan government in exile, and she is due for release in 2023. So Gosherab Gyatso, also known as Gosher, was sentenced to 10 years in prison in August last year, and these sentencing of Tibetan public intellectuals, writers, and people who protect Tibetan culture and language, it is part of Chinese government's attempt to culturally assimilate the Tibetan identity.
To fulfill China's treaty commitments, all laws and policies perpetuating human rights violations must be reviewed, repealed, and brought in line with international law.
If you look at China, and if you look at Tibet, China has already built up a surveillance state inside Tibet, where even one small information cannot surpass or cannot go beyond. So they have already built up this all-encompassing surveillance mechanism inside Tibet. And inside Tibet, people are suffering, and we are not getting much information about it because of this nature. So the international community need to tell the Chinese government that belligerence and the coercion measures will not succeed, will not help them. Rather, the Tibetans need to raise their voice. Tibetans have a distinct language, culture, identity, and Tibet's ecology also very important, not just for the Tibetans but to all the world. So the international communities need to raise their voice against the Chinese government in giving Tibetans what they aspire for in preserving their culture, identity, and their language.
자베미 단답도 나한테 다른 무이트니 나야 소리 지레다 첩지 좀 배기 내다 첩지 좀 배기 루규 아니 학벌도 아니 콘도 종가 하나를 여발해 찍고 멤버체 그러봐 계지나로리아 시구이나 종가 하나를 차베 제일 콘도 내다 그래도 다야죠 좀 망고 싶지기 고 캠프 잡으래 종가 주부래 로제 로디게 서버래 아니 디네 말려버래 삼네 아니 그 루규 좋아서 지금도 대 좋아요 말아 그 대제일이야 밑이기 내다 그래도 다 간다 수부 종간나는 요 말하면 더 지기 좀 만나 시지지 대디 좀 뭐요 봐 간다 배나 로제에 배준라고 차시나 접수 좀 받지리야 로제 롱아 차 서바 차시나 대나로야 접수 왕자 로직 초바 로니 로숨산데 요래 접수 왕자 로직이 초스도 가라 종간나 말로 차베 제일 지도가는 계란가 접수 도다 크게 매수고 도도 재미나.
So we send communications to the UN special procedures and we ask for their urgent intervention and also to seek information on the condition and the well-being of the Tibetan political prisoners who are currently detained. And we also ask for the immediate release of these political prisoners who have been charged with vague and overbroad charges. And on top of that, we also provide the United Nations special procedures with information from our end regarding the details of detention and the arbitrary nature of these detentions.
These are few known cases of political prisoners who managed to escape Tibet and reach into exile. However, we must not forget there are many Tibetan political prisoners who weren't lucky enough to reach to safety and whose stories still remain unheard.
Zang ma lu